Welcome back to another episode of The Conscious Artist, a safe space for conversations around mental health awareness for musicians, artists, and all human beings. I am your host, Pallavi Mahidara. I'm a concert pianist and teacher, and I am absolutely thrilled that you are joining us today. My hope for this show is that it will give all of us a sense of solidarity and knowledge that we are not alone, and together, through these conversations, we can create more awareness and change for a healthier future. I have been fangirling over our final guest for this season for months. And the funny thing is that we've actually known each other since we were 10 and 12 years old, respectively. We lost touch for a while, as happens in life. And when we randomly reconnected last fall, I knew I had to interview her for this show. She is a cognitive scientist and is a senior director of behavioral economics at Google. She served as a senior advisor in the Obama White House, where she founded the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team, and she is the creator, host, and executive producer of my new favorite podcast, A Slight Change of Plans. But none of this was part of her original plan in life. My guest today has a story that I know some of you listening will be able to relate to in ways that even I cannot. Her perspective, her empathy, and her resilience in the face of her own life-changing experiences are so inspirational and make me feel so proud to know her and to be able to call her my friend. Please join me in welcoming absolute boss woman, Dr. Maya Shankar. Maya, welcome to The Conscious Artist. I'm so happy to have you here with us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Pallavi. And I'm so proud of you, and I'm so proud of this podcast that you're making. And yeah, it was so funny. I was telling my husband Jimmy this morning more about your podcast and you, and I was like, literally have known her since I was 12, and I was recounting our Disney orchestra escapades. So that was a fun moment.
I hope we can talk more about that moment because, oh my gosh, where do we even begin? There are just so many things I want to chat with you today about. But first, would you mind sharing a little bit of your backstory and how you actually reached your current path in life?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, what's interesting is that when I go back to 12, which is the age that I met you at, the violin was completely the centerpiece of my life. I'd started playing when I was 6 years old. My mom went up to our attic and brought down my grandmother's violin. She had played Indian classical music, so Carnatic style, and my mom had only really meant to just show me the instrument. My other siblings had dismissed the violin as being quote not cool, and so I apparently I wasn't cool because I thought it was awesome, or maybe they were just wrong, and the violin is actually amazing. So I took to the instrument really effortlessly. My mom says she never had to tell me to practice. That I would run home from school and immediately pick up the instrument. And then when I was 9, things became more serious. So I auditioned for the Juilliard School in New York. Um, it's funny. I mean, given your audience, it's like, duh, we know what Juilliard is, Maya. For most audiences that I talk to, I have to be like the Juilliard School of Music. So I auditioned for Juilliard pre-college program, was very fortunately accepted. And that began, I'm sure you can so relate to this. You know, you're on the speed train and you have no time to assess anything really. It's just music, music, music all the time. And so I had very big dreams of maybe becoming a professional musician. I honestly didn't know if I had what it took for a very long time. But then when I was in high school, Itzhak Perlman asked me to be his private violin student. And for me, that was an incredible vote of confidence. I felt like, oh, okay, even though I don't feel as technically gifted as some of my peers, he at least feels like I have something meaningful to say in my music, or that he's connecting with me emotionally such that maybe there's a path forward. So that was the first time when I think as a family, like even with my parents, we seriously considered violin being my future. I mean, I think, my parents were coming from a background of like, okay, we want to send our kids to, liberal arts schools, make sure that they have lots of safety nets. Violence seemed a little more precarious. But I think when Perlman stepped in, they were like, okay, Maya, if you really want to do this, we support the conservatory path. And then, as you alluded to in the intro, my life took a serious turn. One morning at music camp, I was on Shelter Island at the Perlman Music Program, and it was a pretty cold morning. And I think at the time, I don't know whether I was supposed to be stretching and didn't know that I should be, or warming up, but I didn't. And maybe that was because I was an impatient teenager. Maybe that was because we didn't know the science as well of, how, how physically demanding playing an instrument is. But I overstretched my finger on a single note in a Paganini Caprice, number 13, and it involved fingered octaves. And
Mm.
so I remember feeling a very sharp, acute pain in my hand and worrying that something was wrong, but also just trying to ignore it, which is what I did for weeks and actually months. Like I was playing through pain and I was taking lots of anti-inflammatories and just trying to get through the next concert and the next concert and the next concert. And then finally, doctors decided, she just needs to stop playing. This is not okay. And basically my dreams ended overnight, and then I had to learn how to find a new path forward.
Wow. Thank you, first of all, for sharing your story with us. I do know your story well. And seriously, every time I hear it, it breaks my heart because just thinking about your injury back then, how devastating it must have been for you at that time, to know that you couldn't really play again. Um, I mean, I know for me personally, I can't live without music and I've never wanted to do anything else. But your story makes me think of something very important that many of us, I'm afraid, don't even realize. For example, when I introduce myself to a stranger, I say, "Hi, I'm Pallavi Mahidara. I'm a concert pianist." That's
Mm,
how I subconsciously define myself. We often tie our identities to our professions, and it makes me ponder the question, who are we without our instruments and without our art? And I know this is something that you've spoken about with Adam Grant, with Sophia Bush, with Laurie Santos, and others on your own podcast and on theirs. And this concept you speak of, if I'm not mistaken, is called identity foreclosure. And
hmm
I was wondering if you wouldn't mind explaining a little bit more in depth about that and how it relates to artists.
Yeah, wow. I think artists can really relate to identity foreclosure, especially those who take up their art early in life. But it refers to the idea that we can become very fixed in our sense of self and in our self identity when we're young, certainly in adolescence, but it can persist into adulthood. And when we become cemented in a specific identity that's attached to, specific things, like in my case, the violin, it can prevent us from having an exploratory mindset and allowing us to see other identities that we might be able to embody. And I certainly felt that I fell prey to this. As you said, I mean, I was first and foremost a violinist. That was how I came to define myself. To this day, my right shoulder is slightly elevated compared to my left because of all the hours I spent doing this. My spine is somewhat curved. Like my body literally grew around the ergonomics of the violin, and I felt like it was an extension of my body. In fact, maybe I guess you can't relate to this as a pianist, but I know that when I was a kid, when I wasn't carrying my violin around my shoulder, like on trips and whatnot, I felt like something was missing. It's as though you're missing your purse and you don't know where it is, but it was such a part of me and such an intimate part of who I was that when I lost the ability to play the violin, and that was a complicated story filled with lots of misdiagnoses and whatnot, I really did feel at a loss in terms of what my future could hold. I was maybe a year or two out of going to college. I remember thinking, but violin's my thing. Like if I don't have the violin, what do I have? What is my value? What could I even bring to the table?
Mm.
And that was extremely disorienting. And then of course there was the frustration that my mind knew how to play the violin, but my body couldn't. Right? It's an interesting disconnect that
Mm.
occurs where you're listening to a piece of music, or you know exactly how you would want to execute a piece, exactly what the turn of phrase would look like, exactly what your vibrato would sound like, and you just can't physically execute on it, and that is so frustrating. Right now, I'm in a very different position where I've lost so much of the physical ability and so much of the muscle memory that I wouldn't be able to do quite that. But I remember back then it was just, yeah, it's taunting in a way because you know exactly what your musical dreams are with a certain piece, but you don't have the ability to play it, and you envy all your peers who seem to not have these kinds of injuries and ergonomic issues. And so yeah, it was a really tough time. And I remember I mentioned how stubborn I was in the aftermath of the injury. And then I do remember Perlman would teach me just open strings for a period of time where he was like, look, her left hand doesn't work, but maybe it'll heal and let's focus on her right hand. And I remember just playing open strings in lessons, hoping that we could perfect my sound. And so my teachers weren't willing to give up on me either, which was obviously a very beautiful gift they gave me. But then again, there was a certain point that came where it was clear that the stream that I had to end.
Wow, I honestly can't even imagine how disorienting, as you said, that was. And, you know, you're so incredibly accomplished and successful now, but that doesn't take away from how painful an experience that must have been. And I don't think you're alone in the fact that injuries often derail careers. You know, I mean, we of course we know of some famous artists who have had to basically stop playing with their right hand. For example, Gary Graffman or Leon Fleischer, even Pamela Frank. For a
Mm-hmm.
while wasn't able to play. This isn't a new thing, but it's a very, the effects that it can have on our mental health are, I think, extremely damaging long term. And this brings me back to your explanation of identity foreclosure. It seems like when we attach ourselves to things, whether it's, material things or professions or hobbies or whatever it is, it seems like a surefire way to hinder our own personal growth somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Like to attach ourselves to something in such a fixed way doesn't really allow for the possibility of growth and change, right?
Yeah, that's something that I had to learn the hard way. I mean, I think it's very natural as a child to attach yourself to any given pursuit, right? Any specific activity. Oh, I'm a runner. I'm a frisbee player. I'm a violinist. I'm a cook, whatever it is that you love to do. And what losing the violin taught me is that I had to figure out what it is about the violin that I loved because I had to try to figure out if there were other places that I could find that because I had no other option. I mean, I was always going to choose the violin first if given an option. But when you don't have an option, you start to think about whether your identity should instead be attached to features of the pursuit that you love. And then you hope that you can find that in other places. And so what I realized was that, I mean, music made my heart sing, right? Which is actually, that was the part that was harder to find elsewhere because I mean, right, I'll listen to like the second movement of Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, right? There are certain sacred works of art that like, noise canceling headphones in the dark by myself. I tried to get my husband into this, who used to play the violin too. It's not happening, probably. Um, but, I'm sitting there listening to the Emperor Concerto, and you're like my heart starts racing at certain points, right? I'm having this incredible physiological response, um, and there's this moment where I have this incredible visual imagery where it's almost like the sun is rising, like there's a clearing, and it's so beautiful to me. And I think part of me was like, well, I'm never, yeah, how am I going to find that? Like, I remember, and again, I guess I'm a sucker for Beethoven, but I remember as a young child listening to Beethoven's violin concerto and also just feeling overwhelmed by this like wave of feeling and emotion. It's so incredible. So that is to say, like, I don't have a perfect ending because you're not going to be able to find all the traits of the thing that you love elsewhere. But maybe you can find some of them. And one of the features, uh, of playing the violin that I loved was the ability to emotionally connect with humans. It's an incredible feeling. Obviously, you're connecting with your audience, which is a powerful experience, right? You're hopefully I can give to them the same experience that I have listening to Beethoven with wireless headphones. Sorry, with noise canceling headphones. Um, so that's an incredible feeling to maybe make people feel something that they've never felt before. But then also the connecting with other musicians you're playing with. So my favorite kind of music to play was chamber music, where you're on a team. You know, you're finding commonalities in one another. You're learning about each other's personalities based on the way that you decide to craft a phrase. Um, and the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So that was another thing that made me tick. And so ultimately, what I learned from that experience is okay, whatever I do has to be about understanding and feeling human connection. And ideally, I'm working on teams. Those are the two through lines for me. And ultimately, what that led me to do is study the mind. So I'm a cognitive scientist. I study human behavior. I study why it is that we feel emotions, how we make decisions, what drives our behaviors, how we connect with other human beings. And I left academia because I realized that I needed to be in a more social environment. And so, at the White House, I was working on teams. In my podcasting world now, with a slight change of plans, I'm working on teams. Uh, I find so much energy from that human connection that at a minimum, I've been able to find some pieces of what I lost with music in other places, which has been wonderful. But again, it's so important that I give a slightly more sobering account, which is like when you lose something, you won't find all of it. And the type of experience, like I'm obsessed with this one violinist, Stefan Jakiv. I knew him also when I was really little. Um, he just his Beethoven is perfect to me. I mean, I ended up flying. It's the first concert I've ever flown to see. Like my right before the pandemic,
Wow.
my husband and I flew to San Diego and we heard him play the Beethoven Violin Concerto with the San Diego Symphony. And yeah, there's like nothing quite like having that musical experience. And it is different when you're a listener, in part because you have expectations that are not always met. Like I had heard Stefan's recording so often that even though his live performance was beautiful, I was like, wait, no, 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 no. You were supposed to make it sound like that. Or like the tempo was supposed to, like it is different when you're a listener, but it's still so immersive and amazing. Um, but there's nothing like being in the driver's seat as a musician where you get to determine, or ideally in the ideal world where, you practice sufficiently that you really are in control of how every phrase comes out. But there's just nothing quite like getting to orchestrate, no pun, what that emotional experience looks like for you. I'm sure I mean, you're such an accomplished pianist. I'm sure you get that thrill so often in your day-to-day life.
I do honestly, and thank you for sharing this and for sharing your feelings and your vulnerability, because honestly, you described exactly how I feel when I listen to music and when I play this music, these great works of art. And sometimes this is a very quick side note, but sometimes when I'm teaching and I'm trying to help my students feel the music and not just play the notes, sometimes I wonder, like, but how do I describe this? Like, doesn't everyone just feel this? Like, isn't this music just universally felt in
Yeah,
this magical
totally.
way?
And it is very piece dependent. I mean, that's something I've learned, which is, I mean, it's been an interesting realization for me to learn that like I'm not a through and through classical music lover. Turns out I have very particular preferences. Some pieces move me and make me, comma, the atheist, believe in like heavens above, and then other pieces do nothing for me. And I do feel like maybe more genuine classical music lovers love the whole range, but I'm just not one of those people. So it's possible with your students that it's really about finding finding alignment for them, like that emotional match, the emotional puzzle piece, as just an entry point so that they understand what their emotional potential can be. So like testing out a few pieces or concertos or whatnot, and then at least they know they can strive for that, even if they don't find resonance in everything that they're working on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder if it's also, this is something I talk about actually in my first episode on the show
Mm,
with Gary Hoffman about authenticity as a musician. I think that makes a huge difference in how one connects with a performance and with a piece
mm,
based on how connected the performer is with themselves and with the
mm,
music.
mm-hmm.
But but we're digressing now. No, what I wanted to bring it back to something that you said earlier. I had spoken with another colleague in another episode about physical injuries and about their relationship to mental stress. And I'm curious to know now, as a cognitive behavioral and neuroscientist, if you think there might have been a relation between your physical injury and stress, mental stress.
It's a good question. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say definitively, but I believe there's probably a strong case to be made that stress expresses itself in physical form. And I remember always having tightness issues, like my upper back was always super tight. I always felt like, I mean, I'd watch other people play the violin, and it always felt like, physically speaking anyway, the violin rested so easily on their shoulders and everything looked effortless. I mean, you look at even Perlman playing and like he violates all the rules around, ideal form. I remember Toby, his wife, telling me like, oh, it's a challenge for Isaac, that's his nickname. That's her nickname for him. Like for Isaac to teach you guys all technique because he doesn't follow any of the rules and it just works for his body type.
Mm.
So it always felt like there was an ease with which they held the instrument. And I always felt like things were more labored. Like it just didn't always quite feel super comfortable when I was shifting and using vibrato. I don't know if other musicians can relate to just never quite feeling like the posture and the positioning is perfect. And I would always be tweaking, like I'd always be tweaking my coon and
Mm.
tweaking the way that the instrument was and the chin rest and all that stuff. And so I felt like deep emotional comfort with the instrument, but I was always struggling ergonomically. And I do wonder if that was in part because it was an extremely stressful environment that I was in. I probably always felt a little bit out of place. I always felt imposter syndrome. I always, every time you get better, your peer group elevates along with that improvement, right?
Mm.
So you're just constantly, you can be in a constant state of insecurity. So like I came to Juilliard not even being able to read sheet music. I learned the Suzuki method. I was just learning everything by ear. I was thrown into orchestras where you're forced to sight read. And over time you learn and you get better at that sort of thing. And, I went from being literally like last chair of the second violin section to eventually being, for certain, I don't remember all the concerts we had for certain concerts, the concertmaster. And you would think like, oh, wow, you have this feeling of arrival. But it's like, no, now you're a new peer group or all the violinists who are at some point rotating in and out of the concertmaster space. Or, oh my gosh, I'm studying with Itzhak Perlman. This is incredible. I've like really reached that milestone. Now, who fill up all your studio classes, your master classes, who are in all the performance circles, all the other students of Perlman, and
Mm.
Dorothy DeLay, who I was studying with even prior to Perlman. So I think there's just a compounding, or at a minimum, there's a stable level of stress and insecurity that persists as a musician, especially when you're young and you're trying to figure out what you're made of and what you have and if you have what it takes. And if anything, it can just add, it can compound over time. So yeah, I certainly found there to be immensely joyful moments with music, but also equally frustrating moments with my instrument where I felt like I mentioned this before, but I never really felt very technically gifted. As I mentioned, I had a pretty, I would say, uncharacteristic start as a musician. My parents didn't know much about the Western classical music world, and so my mom just found a local graduate student who had never taught anyone before, who was teaching me the violin, and we went straight to pieces. I never played scales or etudes or any of the structural elements that can make a musician great. I just wasn't exposed to any of that. I learned one etude for my Juilliard audition and one scale for my Juilliard audition. So I always felt like I was technically very behind, and that was holding me back because I did feel like I had so much to express musically, but I couldn't always translate it as I wanted to. And I asked Toby much later. Like there was a one other musician I felt like she was in the same boat as me, that we were not maybe as technically gifted. And I was like, why did he take us on? Like, why did he take me on? And she said it's because he felt you had something to say, which was so
Mm.
beautiful. And I love that he saw that because I did feel at the time like that was maybe all I was bringing since I didn't have uh, the technical prowess. So to answer, sorry, I'm going on, but I feel like to answer your question, I think stress plays a big role in injury. And I wasn't looking out. I mean, now we have all this awareness, like mindfulness, meditation, deep breathing, just awareness of self. I never had any awareness of self other than, ow, this hurts, or ow, my back hurts, right? And so that lack of awareness, I think, allowed probably a lot of underlying issues to go unassessed, right? And unacknowledged. And so yeah, I think we're not always auditing our we weren't, at least I wasn't as a child, kind of auditing my experience to see what my physical health was like and how that related to my mental health. It was just be a good violinist. That was what I was focused on.
Absolutely. And I think that's in our generation, I think our generation and above, that's what we did. There was
Hmm.
no focus on mental health. There was no talk about mental health. And I was very fortunate to have a great teacher actually who was also a Juilliard professor, Julian Martin,
Mm.
and in my high school years, and he really took a lot of care, especially with my physical posture and my physical health at the instrument.
Wow,
Um,
amazing. What an amazing gift.
Really, it was. And I find myself, when I'm teaching, I find myself saying so many things to my students that he said to me, and I don't even realize it until I'm saying it and it's coming out of my mouth. But the point
Yeah.
is, I had that aspect, but all of the mental health aspects, nobody talked about,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm so grateful that now in today's world, where, especially since COVID, it's becoming more and more mainstream. Athletes are talking about it more. Pop stars, celebrities are talking about it more. We still don't talk about it a lot in the classical music world. And that's a
Hmm.
huge reason why I wanted to start this podcast, because I have suffered from physical injuries and mental stress. I've
Yeah.
suffered just like everyone else has. And it's only now, with some knowledge, with a little bit of awareness, and with a lot of guidance and tools,
Mm.
that I'm really learning to connect my mind with my body, you know?
Do you mind sharing what precipitated the physical injury slash mental health challenge for you?
Sure.
Are you thinking of any isolated experience?
Well, there were two big physical injuries that came up in my career thus far.
Mm.
The first one, I was 19 and I was just plain stupid. I was like trying to learn Rachmaninoff's second piano concerto in like a couple days because yeah, I mean, I was just, when you're a teenager, you think you're young and, you're invincible and amazing and
Invincible.
you can do everything. But maybe I could have, because that is a skill that I have. I am able to learn quickly. However,
Mhm.
I was not taking care of the way I was learning. I was not
Mm.
taking care of the way my hand, especially my left hand, this injury happened in my left hand that time. I was not taking care of the way I was playing
Mm.
these difficult, chords, arpeggiated chords. And with Rachmaninoff, as our listeners know, and I talk about this in another episode, his hands were huge. And so
Yeah.
for pianistically, I mean, you have huge chords, huge arpeggiated runs. And if you're not careful about releasing the tension in between every finger, it can really, yeah, well, what happened to me, I got an injury and I wasn't able
Mm.
to open my hand. And I had to stop playing for a month at that time with my left
Oh.
hand.
Had you tore, like mine was a tendon
It
injury
wasn't
associated.
tendinitis, but it was the tendon, like above my wrist, and basically
Mm.
just my hand froze and I couldn't open it. And I don't, at that time, I obviously would have never equated that to mental stress.
Mm.
However, I now know, and I can now acknowledge how insecure I felt while I was at Curtis. I had such an amazing education. I learned so much. But as you
Mm.
said, as you grow in your own abilities, as you climb to higher and higher levels, so do your peers. And so the people you're surrounded with become, I don't want to say competition, but it's a lot if you don't know how
No,
to
you should just say competition because that's the reality of it.
well,
They become competition.
it becomes competition. The thing is that we're not taught
Yeah.
at that time to not compare ourselves to others.
Yeah.
You know,
100%.
we're not taught that we should just compare ourselves to ourselves.
Yeah.
And so
And actually that's making me think I remember Yeah, you just jogged my memory. I remember being at Perlman camp. This was before my injury, and asking Perlman in a group setting. I think it was like a after dinner fireside chat. I was like, he talked about the fact that he was a relatively late bloomer when it came to playing the violin, which is kind of like amazing to hear, given where he ended up. He was like, yeah, these days we've got all these 8-year-old prodigies and stuff, but it was really only when I was a late teenager that he was on the Ed Sullivan show, and then I think he really only blossomed as a musician in his eyes in his later teens. And I asked him, of course, I was the one raising my hand, being like, and how do you deal with those feelings of like competition and jealousy and envy and insecurity, of course. And he said exactly what you said, which was a gift to hear, but it was said too late in my case because it was at the end of my violin career. That he learned to compare himself only to himself, which is what you hear from the greatest athletes in the world and the greatest musicians in the world. And look, of course, you have to have some comparison that you make relative to others to see whether you could become a professional, for example. Like you can't live in a bubble.
Sure.
But once you've established that you might have aptitude or talent or a work ethic that propels you to the top, at that point you really should stop the direct comparison with anyone else. If only because it allows you to preserve your authenticity as a musician and not try to, mimic others or
Mm.
draw parallels that don't really exist. Um, Anyway, sorry, I did want to. I understand you're supposed to be interviewing me, but I'm fascinated by you, so I have to follow up just really quickly on the injury piece. So your hand freezes, and I just want to know what the resolution of that looked like, and whether it informed the second time that you got injured, like whether there was any increased awareness.
Absolutely. After that injury, as I said, I, long story short, I couldn't play with my left hand for a month. And after that, when I started quote unquote relearning, I that was a very formative experience for me. And I really learned how to, especially learn Rachmaninoff well, with my
Mm,
mind, with awareness, with consciousness. And so that first injury was a huge turning point in terms of learning, practicing with more awareness of my physical
yep.
state. The second
Mm.
injury came because apparently I wasn't breathing properly. So after the second injury, yes, I did learn how to breathe properly. But essentially what happened was I was told by an osteopath, basically, this time in like one of the muscles, or probably several muscles from the back of my neck down to my shoulder blade, it froze and I
Mm,
couldn't turn my neck side to side, up and
wow.
down. Like I couldn't move my neck at all. And I literally had 3 concerts the next 3 days. And I was just rehearsing the day before, and this happened. And I went to the osteopath, and he told me that I was only breathing into my chest. I was shallow breathing. And that in turn was not allowing my muscles to receive enough oxygen. And so they were
Mm,
contracting and retaining tension. And that was for me a big turning point. Again, couldn't play for a month, this time with either hand. I couldn't even lift a plate for like 2 weeks. It was so painful. And after working with, the osteopath, with the physiotherapist, finally I was able to release that tension, um, and I started practicing breathing. I actually
mm,
started learning how to breathe. And, when you do yoga, when you do meditation, you learn these things. They
yeah.
teach you to breathe into your stomach. By the way, if you're a singer or a wind player or a brass player, you learn how to breathe correctly from
Yeah.
the beginning.
Yeah. Of course. I find this really interesting because, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners can relate to this. One challenge I think oh, it's funny I'm saying like we as musicians as though I'm still a musician, but
You
once a
are.
musician, always a musician. But we as musicians face is there's this constant feeling of needing to relearn fundamental things, which is really discouraging and hard. Like I think there were probably points along the way where someone would comment, "Oh, your right shoulder is too high," or "Your wrist should be moving like this." And just the idea of unlearning and relearning was so demoralizing because it's like, how does that process unfold when you're also giving performances along the way and you're also trying to maintain a certain level, and you're also, in my case, in a deeply impatient person who wants like results yesterday, and so I'm just curious to know from your experience, because I do wonder if I had more patience, if I had allowed myself, say, to take a 6-month break from performance and active studying and instead just relearned some of the basics that could have helped me avoid injury down the line, that maybe my outcomes would have been different. But I just wonder if, like, how did you carve out the mental and physical space for yourself to really relearn things as fundamental as the way that you breathe or the way that you relax fingers in between arpeggios or whatever it is?
Wow, what a great question. And honestly, it's funny you say this because, I think we've been conditioned in our lives to feel shame if we
Mm,
have to change something, change our minds, change the way we're doing something. But whether it's the way we are interpreting a piece of music or like realizing that we're not playing in the healthiest way, physically or mentally, it's not an easy path, but it's kind of the same reason that when I started going to therapy 2 years ago,
mm,
that all I wanted to do was like 24/7 inner homework. Because,
mm,
and this is just me personally, but I didn't have these tools and this knowledge and this awareness before. And receiving it from my incredible therapist and from all the mentors and inspirational people that I learned from, if I can be a healthier and happier human being and have a better relationship with myself and with others, why wouldn't I want to do that?
mm,
Why wouldn't I want to work for that? This is my own personal mental state. And it was the same thing regarding my physical injuries and my physical
mm,
state and wanting to fix that because I'm seeing that what I'm doing is not working. Someone's telling me there's a better way.
mm,
Why wouldn't I want to do that? But again, this is just the way my brain is wired, and perhaps it comes from my parents, perhaps it comes from my personality, I don't know, but it's also something I teach my students, and it's become sort of my a little bit of my mantra in performing and in playing, which is
mm,
minimal effort for maximum result. And I don't
mm.
mean minimal effort by like meaning laziness. I mean
Yeah, yeah, of
minimal
course.
physical effort, like no
Physical
pain,
effort.
right?
Yes.
Like no pain, no gain doesn't exist with musicians. Like that's if we have pain, we are doing something wrong,
Yep.
And I wish that more people were aware of the long-term damages.
Mm,
My some of my younger students will keep pushing themselves, say, no, but I have to practice. I have this and this and this. And I'm like, no, take a break. Go take a bath. Go for a walk. Don't practice today. Like I'm
yeah,
sitting and telling my students, don't practice today. Don't practice anymore.
yeah. Yeah, and I think the thing that really resonates with me about what you've shared too is we do drive ourselves into the ground. And I certainly thought at some point, I think there's no version of playing the violin that doesn't involve pain. I mean, it just felt like, oh, it's just always going to be uncomfortable, and that's maybe a thing. Um, but to the student of yours that's resisting taking the bath or going for a walk or whatnot, I can share from my own personal experience that, so long story short, at 16 or 15 is when I had the injury. Doctors are going back and forth on lots of things. Eventually, I'm misdiagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, which means
Oh
I'm
my
put on an
gosh.
aggressive regimen of anti inflammatories and immunosuppressants. And that was the moment where they were like, you absolutely should not be playing the violin. And I had much bigger problems on my mind, which is how am I going to deal with this degenerative systemic disease? And what ended up happening is, again, I'm on this regimen for about, yeah, maybe 6 or 7 years. And then I end up going to England to study for grad school. And I see a doctor there. And I go in and I'm like, hey, I have rheumatoid arthritis. I'm just here for a checkup, making sure that I need someone overseas to monitor my care while I'm here. And within moments, he said, you do not have rheumatoid arthritis. And I said, what are you talking about? Of course I do. My medical scans show this. The doctors back home have said this. And he said, well, they've made a mistake. There's some issue here. And sure enough, he looks back at my medical files, and a doctor had mistakenly written the word or had omitted the word not from my medical records. So he had literally said, patient is rheumatoid factor positive, referring to my blood work when actually I was not rheumatoid factor positive.
Oh my
And
gosh.
the the radiologist had in turn been told that I had rheumatoid, and so they were looking at my scans through the lens of oh, this patient has rheumatoid arthritis, and the natural human biases that we all have crept in, which is that they were interpreting my scan through that lens, and they identified all sorts of erosions and whatnot. And what I later learned through this English doctor is that I was 17, so my bones were still growing, which meant the erosions they saw were actually just underdeveloped bone. But they hadn't taken my age into account. And so when they saw the erosions, they might have thought, oh, this person's 60 or 70. And so that same presentation would have appeared to be rheumatoid in a much older person. So anyway, I'm told then at age whatever it was, maybe 22, 23, that I do not have rheumatoid arthritis. And coincidentally, a few weeks later, I get a call from this conference called the Academy of Achievement, and they say, "Hey, you're coming to this conference this summer, and Joshua Bell is actually going to be our guest performer. Would you want to play the Bach double with him?" And I'm thinking to myself, dude, I literally
Wow.
have not picked up my instrument in what, 7 years? But I say yes because that's my personality. And I've just been told I don't have rheumatoid arthritis. So like maybe I can have another foray into violin world. And I end up giving that performance, and NPR calls me and says, "Hey, you were on From the Top 3 times when you were a kid. We're doing a 10th anniversary series and we'd love to have you play the violin." And again, I'm like, I haven't played the violin forever. I don't know if I could do this, but of course I say yes. So I end up doing those 2 performances that year. And I felt like I was a significantly better musician, and I played far better than I ever had, even though I had not touched my physical instrument for an unimaginable number of years, given any normal musician's time off. I mean, you're usually taking a day off, 2 days off, ever, right? And I think the reason for that is I had matured as a person, and I'd had a lot of emotional development. And sure, I lost a lot of technique. I chose a piece that I was capable of playing from a technical perspective. But it felt completely different. The stakes felt different. Like all of a sudden, my relationship with my instrument was just about me and emotional fulfillment. And I remember thinking, what a gift that I've been given, that I have the chance to play again. I never thought I was going to play again. I never thought I was going to perform again. And so it was beautiful that I was given that chance, and it just, the whole calculus changed for me. And I feel like that performance was the one I did for NPR in particular. I think the video's on YouTube or something. Like um, the performance I gave of the Gluck melody was the most emotionally fulfilling, satisfying performance I'd ever given. And so ultimately, that former mindset started to reemerge. I remember in South Africa at the reception after the Josh Bell performance that someone came up to me and she was like, "Oh, I'm actually on the board of the Cape Town Symphony Orchestra." And all of a sudden my brain starts going into like competitive mode with myself. I'm like, I had to like play as a soloist with that orchestra. And it's like, oh gosh, I'm actually doing a PhD now. My life has moved on. Like this is very different. But I felt those old vibes coming back, and I did embrace them for a little bit until it became clear to me that there was so much scar tissue buildup in my hand from surgeries and the drugs and the misuse of my hands in those intervening periods, because I wasn't actually solving the correct problem, that I could not play the violin in any long term, which was sad because obviously I really wanted to. But I just want the lesson for your listeners to be that distance is good from your instrument, distance is healthy. um, we should think about our instruments as vehicles of expression, um, vehicles for expression, vehicles for the expression of the things that we are living through. And it's important to make sure you're also living so that outside of your instruments, so that you have emotions and thoughts and ideas to bring back to that experience. And I saw that unfold in a very severe way in my life, which is again, like there was a 6 or 7 year distance between me and the last time I'd played. And I saw the benefits firsthand that I was totally not expecting. Like the most incredible thing to me is, when I was a violinist, I was playing on these obscenely wealthy instruments, like all these loaner instruments. They'd be like, "Oh yeah, here's like a $500,000 violin. Try this." And like I remember Joshua Bell generously let me play his Stradivarius when we were
Wow.
practicing together, and it was like probably $8 million or something. So I had the opportunity, even as a really young kid, to play on just, I mean, my dad would joke like, "Oh my gosh, this is worth more than like our house and all the other things." Um, but when I went back for that Gluck Melody performance and I was playing just on the violin that we owned, that my family was capable of buying at that moment in time, I produced a more beautiful sound on that instrument that I had on any of the expensive instruments that I had ever played. And I think there's something to be said about that. Like the raw materials weren't great, but I had changed in a really meaningful way. And I was viewing my instrument differently and I was viewing music differently. Um, and I felt that that came through. And it's kind of amazing. I never expected that.
That's such a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing that. It makes me think of something that I remember you actually mentioned in your interview with Laurie Santos,
Mm,
about how our personality traits change gradually through life. And thank God for that. I wouldn't want to think the same way. I wouldn't want to behave the same way now as I did when I was 5 or 15 or
mm,
25. But as an artist, we know that a performance is never finished, a piece is
mm,
never finished. We know that it will never feel, or it cannot feel exactly the same, even 2 nights in a row, even the same day, even 5 minutes from each other, right? Because
mm-hmm,
everything is
mm-hmm.
different. We are different. We are not the same as we were 5 minutes ago. But I think the most beautiful change comes from when we allow ourselves to experience change. The funny thing is that the only permanent aspect of life is change.
Yeah,
The only permanence in life is impermanence. and
absolutely.
and I feel like sometimes, maybe not everyone is able or willing to open Pandora's box and reflect inwards. It's not easy to look within and acknowledge that we aren't quote unquote perfect or that we can improve,
Mm,
and probably much of that comes from the external validation that society has conditioned us to believe that we need. But
yeah.
also, so many of us don't have the tools to do that inner work. And as I said, like I certainly didn't have those tools before I started going to therapy last year. I mean, honestly, I feel like I was asleep for the first 34 years of my life. Like I don't know what I was doing. But as a cognitive
For
scientist,
being asleep, you were a damn good pianist. So just saying.
thanks. As a cognitive scientist, what do you feel prevents us the most from feeling free to grow and change on a day-to-day basis? Why is it that inner transformation often only comes out of some big life experience,
Mm.
such as, death of a loved one or giving birth or getting a divorce or having an injury?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question because you're right. We shouldn't wait for these explosive events in our lives to re-examine who we are or be open to change. Um, I think one is just rooted in a behavioral bias called the status quo bias, which is that we like business as usual. We like inertia is comfortable, and challenging the status quo and introducing new change into our life can come with a lot of volatility, and it's a volatility that might be unwelcome and that we might not actually enjoy. And so there's a risk factor eh, associated with exploration, and it's not all of us have that risk tolerance. I mean, I don't, right? Like I study change for a living. I have a whole podcast on change. I hate change for the most part. I mean, sure, it's nice to have some positive changes, but I am a creature of habit. I like routine. I like things going as planned and as expected in many ways. My inspiration for creating the show is that I do have such a low tolerance for change and risk that I wanted to actually increase my tolerance because I think
Hmm.
as humans, we can grow so much from change. And as my guests have shown me on my podcast, even people who have been through just awful gut wrenching change have still found some areas of growth at a minimum, which is helpful. But I mean, it's hard to deny our human nature, and so while we can try to push ourselves to change in the absence of these significant events that throw our life into some sort of turmoil and make us reassess things, that might be the reality for most of us. And but I think that's okay because it allows us to see that there can be a silver lining in the face of a very unexpected or unwanted change, which is we're likely to reimagine who we are and what we care about and what we value, our relationships with others, our relationship with ourselves. All those things can happen in the fallout of a big life change. And that growth can be very rewarding and very fulfilling.
I can 100% relate to that. I had a very big change in my personal life last year that has been a catalyst for removing the metaphorical straitjacket I've been wearing my whole
Mm,
life. And it has opened my mind and my heart in ways that I couldn't have even imagined. I feel like I used to look at the world through a hole in the wall. And
mm,
whatever I could see through the hole is what I thought the whole world was.
mm.
And last
So
year, that
beautiful.
world came
Yeah.
crashing down. And all of a sudden, I had a 180-degree view. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's so many things that I've been missing out on. And I'm
It's so
still
beautiful.
trying to
Yeah.
knock down the rest of the wall to get a 360 view, but it helped me also to realize that it helped me to think more about my purpose in life.
Mm,
And this is something you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation about asking yourself what it was that you loved about music and about playing the violin and how you could apply that in other ways and in other fields and in another path for yourself. And, I always thought that my purpose in life was just music,
mm,
to share my music with others through performing and later on through teaching.
mm,
Then I thought, oh, maybe it's to communicate and share through music. So performing, teaching, and mentoring. And now
mm,
I'm realizing that it's actually broader than that. Maybe it's just simply to share my purpose in life,
mm,
to share. And I only realized that after I started working on this podcast,
mm,
realizing that I wanted to be able to share my own personal experiences. I wanted to share my vulnerability, and I wanted to share the experiences and the expertise of incredible artists and scientists and therapists and psychiatrists and everyone around the
mm,
world that I know can help benefit the artistic community.
mm,
It's been such a huge source of inspiration and education for me, this podcast so far. And I'm so grateful for the chance to be able to share in a more universal way. And hopefully, as you say, the reason I perform, the reason I play music is because I love to share and I love to connect with people. And if I can make an audience member feel even a tenth of what I feel with this music
mm,
and give them some hope and some joy in that, that's the reason I do it. And the same, I feel the same way about this podcast that, I know that so many people, so many of us struggle with very similar things. We may come from different places. We may have different circumstances. We may have endured different traumas, different difficulties, different struggles. But at the end of the day, we can find solace in collective healing, I think.
mm. Wow. Yeah, that is very poignant and very beautiful and so resonates with my own experience, and I think for those who have been lucky enough to never face injury or any other event that prevents them from doing the thing they love, I think it's a good test for yourself to ask yourself the questions about what you think your purpose is or what the features are of the thing you're doing right now, are, because life can change in a moment. And I've always felt like it's more durable, it's more steady, it's more stable to have a mission statement like to share rather than for it to be a pianist. I hope you can be a pianist for the rest of your life, but I know for sure that you can share for the rest of your life. And that's a lovely realization to stumble upon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here and for taking the time to have this conversation with me. I mean, I could just go on with you for hours and hours and hours.
Totally.
I need to bring you back for another season, please.
Absolutely. Consider it done. Consider it done.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your vulnerability and your own perspective on how change has affected your life and how beautifully and gracefully you have taken those difficulties and shaped them into such positive paths for yourself and for others. So thank you so much, Maya.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all so much for listening. I am truly grateful for the support from each and every one of you. If you would like to submit any questions or topics for us to address on the show, you can send us a message on our Instagram page @ConsciousArtistPodcast. Help us to spread more awareness by sharing this episode with your friends, your colleagues, your teachers, and your students. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Sending you all so much love and strength, and we will see you next time for another episode of The Conscious Artist.